Carl Jung, the man who mapped the soul. Hello, my friends. Today I want to tell you the story of a man who looked inward, deeper than almost anyone before him, and came back with a map. Not a map of continents or oceans, not a map of stars or chemical elements, a map of the human soul itself, of the hidden forces that shape our dreams, our fears, our loves, our obsessions, and our deepest sense of who we are. His name was Carl Gustav Jung. He was a Swiss psychiatrist, a visionary thinker, and one of the most controversial and influential minds of the 20th century. He gave us concepts that have become so embedded in modern culture that millions of people use them every day without knowing where they came from. The introvert and the extravert, the shadow, the archetype, the collective unconscious, the midlife crisis, synchronicity. He was Sigmund Freud's most brilliant student and his most devastating critic. He was a scientist who took dreams seriously, a rationalist who studied mythology, alchemy, and mystical experience with the same rigorous attention he gave to clinical case studies. A man who had a psychological breakdown so severe that it nearly destroyed him, and who emerged from it with insights that would reshape the way human beings understand themselves. His story is one of genius and madness, of friendship and betrayal, of a man who spent his entire life trying to understand what it means to be a complete human being, and who paid a very high personal price for that understanding. So sit back, relax, and let us journey inward, into the depths of the human psyche, guided by the man who mapped it. Chapter 1. A child between two worlds. Carl Gustav Jung was born on the 26th of July, 1875, in the small Swiss village of Keswil, on the southern shore of Lake Constance. He was the son of a Protestant pastor named Johann Paul Achilles Jung, and a kind, intellectually curious man who struggled quietly but visibly with his own faith, and Emily Preiswerk, a woman of considerable intelligence and a distinctly unusual inner life. Emily Jung was, by the standards of her time and her social position, a deeply unconventional woman. She kept a private journal in which she recorded her dreams and visions. She claimed to experience presences, spiritual visitors, she called them, who appeared to her at night. Her family had a long tradition of involvement with spiritualism and the occult, which was, in the late 19th century, not merely a fringe interest, but a subject of widespread intellectual and social fascination. Young Carl grew up in a household shaped by these two currents. His father's rational, institutional Christianity, struggling against creeping doubt, and his mother's stranger, more intuitive relationship with invisible forces. From the very beginning, he lived between two worlds, the world of official, respectable, rational thought, and a darker, stranger, more powerful world that seemed to pulse beneath the surface of everyday reality. He was a solitary child, deeply interior, more comfortable with his own thoughts than with other children, prone to long periods of absorption in private fantasy and reflection. He had, from very early, a sense that he contained within himself two distinct personalities, what he would later call personality number one and personality number two. Number one was the ordinary schoolboy, the son of the pastor, the child who had to eat his meals and do his homework and behave appropriately in social situations. Number two was something else entirely, older, somehow, and deeper, connected to history and nature and forces that the ordinary world refused to acknowledge. This sense of a divided self, of an outer personality that functioned in the social world and an inner personality that lived in depths the outer world could not see, would become one of the central preoccupations of his entire intellectual life. He was also, from childhood, a child of extraordinarily vivid and disturbing dreams. One dream from early childhood, he estimated he was between 3 and 4 years old, stayed with him for the rest of his life, and became, in his autobiography, one of the most discussed passages in the literature of psychology. He dreamed of a dark stone chamber underground, where a huge, fleshy, rounded object sat on a golden throne. An object that he understood, with the wordless certainty of dream logic, to be some kind of underground god. His mother's voice came from above, calling out, "That is the man-eater." He woke, terrified, and the image never left him. Decades later, he would interpret this dream as his first encounter with what he would call the collective unconscious. The deep layer of the psyche that lies beneath the personal, that contains the accumulated symbolic experience of the entire human species, that speaks in the language of myth and image rather than logic and language. But that understanding was a long way off. First, there was the business of growing up. Chapter 2. The doctor of the soul Jung was a gifted student, broad in his interests, intellectually restless, drawn simultaneously to science and to the humanities in a way that made him difficult to categorize. He read voraciously philosophy, theology, natural science, literature. He was particularly drawn to the German idealist philosophers, Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, who asked the largest possible questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human existence. He eventually chose medicine, partly because it offered a scientific framework he respected, and partly because it seemed to offer a path toward the questions that genuinely obsessed him: the nature of the mind, the relationship between the physical and the psychological, the mystery of mental illness and its treatment. He studied medicine at the University of Basel, and then, in 1900, moved to Zurich to begin his psychiatric training at the Burg-Hölzli Psychiatric Hospital, one of the leading psychiatric institutions in Europe at the time, directed by the distinguished psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler, who would later coin the term schizophrenia. Working at the Burg-Hölzli was a formative experience. Jung worked directly with severely mentally ill patients, people suffering from what we would today call schizophrenia, psychosis, severe depression, and other conditions that, in 1900, were poorly understood and largely untreatable. He was struck from the beginning by something that many of his colleagues seemed to overlook: that the apparently meaningless ravings of psychotic patients were not meaningless at all. They were filled with imagery, with symbols, with figures, with themes that recurred across different patients, that appeared in mythology and folklore from cultures the patients had never encountered, that seemed to be drawing on some common reservoir of human symbolic experience. This observation would eventually become the cornerstone of his theoretical system. But first he needed tools, a language, and a method for understanding the deeper layers of the mind. He found them, initially, in the work of a man in Vienna whose ideas were simultaneously illuminating and ultimately insufficient. Chapter 3. Freud. The Meeting of Two Giants. In 1906, Jung sent a copy of his published research to Sigmund Freud in Vienna. Freud, already the most famous and controversial figure in European psychiatry, read it with great interest and wrote back. The two men began a correspondence that quickly became one of the most intellectually electric exchanges in the history of psychology. They met in person for the first time in February 1907 in Vienna. By all accounts, the meeting was extraordinary. They talked for 13 hours without stopping. Two men who had found in each other an intellectual equal, capable of engaging with the questions that consumed them both. Freud was 19 years older than Jung, and he saw in the younger man something he had been looking for, a brilliant, scientifically credible heir to carry psychoanalysis forward and give it the legitimacy that its association with Freud alone, a Jewish Viennese doctor working in a field that polite society considered disreputable, could not provide. Jung, for his part, was genuinely excited by Freud's ideas, by the concept of the unconscious as an active force in mental life, by the interpretation of dreams as meaningful communications from the deeper layers of the psyche, by the radical proposition that much of what drives human behavior operates below the level of conscious awareness. But from the beginning, there were tensions, theoretical and personal, that would eventually make their rupture inevitable. Freud believed that the unconscious was, at its core, a reservoir of repressed sexual and aggressive impulses, desires and experiences that the conscious mind found unacceptable and had pushed below the surface. Everything, dreams, symptoms, slips of the tongue, artistic creation, could be traced back, ultimately, to this sexual energy, which Freud called the libido. Jung was not convinced. He agreed that sexuality was important. He agreed that repression was a real and significant psychological mechanism, but he could not accept that sexuality explained everything. His experience with patients, particularly with the recurring mythological imagery in psychotic patients' delusions, convinced him that the unconscious contained something much larger and much stranger than a collection of repressed personal memories. For several years he suppressed his doubts out of loyalty to Freud and out of genuine respect for the older man's genius. Freud designated Jung his crown prince, his chosen successor as the leader of the psychoanalytic movement. Jung became the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. He was, in every external sense, Freud's heir, but the doubts would not stay suppressed, and when Jung finally voiced them, in a 1912 book called Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, published in English as Symbols of Transformation, the break became inevitable. The book argued, among other things, that the libido was not primarily sexual energy, but a more general life force, a psychic energy that could be expressed in many ways, of which sexuality was only one. It argued that myths and religious symbols were not merely disguised expressions of repressed sexuality, but genuine psychological realities, expressions of deep patterns in the human psyche that had nothing to do with personal repression. Freud read the book and understood immediately what it meant. In 1913, the two men met for the last time at a psychoanalytic congress in Munich. Their personal relationship ended. They never spoke again. The break devastated Jung, far more than he had expected. He had genuinely loved Freud in the complicated way that a brilliant son loves an imperfect father. And the loss of that relationship, combined with the professional isolation that followed, Most of the psychoanalytic community sided with Freud, pushed Jung towards the edge of a psychological crisis that would prove to be the most important and most terrifying experience of his life. Chapter 4. The Descent into the Unconscious. Between 1913 and 1919, Carl Jung underwent what he himself described as a confrontation with the unconscious, a period of such intense psychological instability that he feared at times that he was losing his mind entirely. He resigned his teaching position at the University of Zurich. He withdrew from most of his professional commitments. He spent hours each day in a kind of deliberate, self-induced descent into the depths of his own psyche, allowing images, figures, and voices to arise from the unconscious and engaging with them directly, dialoguing with them, drawing them, writing them down. He called this process active imagination, and he would later teach it to his patients as a therapeutic technique. But at the time, it was not a technique. It was a desperate attempt to understand what was happening to him. The figures he encountered in these inner journeys were vivid, autonomous, and deeply strange. There was a wise old man he called Philemon, a figure with the wings of a kingfisher and the horns of a bull, who walked with him in his garden and taught him things he felt he could not have known on his own. There was a young woman he called Anima, a figure who seemed to represent the feminine dimension of his own psyche, sometimes helpful, sometimes seductive, sometimes deeply threatening. He filled notebook after notebook with these encounters, writing, drawing, painting with a compulsive intensity. The notebooks were eventually compiled, after his death, into a massive illuminated volume called the Red Book, one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of psychology, a kind of illustrated inner odyssey that was not published in full until 2009, almost 50 years after Jung's death. Was this a psychotic breakdown? Was it a deliberate spiritual exploration? Was it a creative process that looked like madness from the outside, but was something else entirely from the inside? Jung himself was never entirely sure. What he was sure of was that he emerged from this period with the core insights that would define his entire subsequent work. The unconscious was not merely a dustbin of repressed personal memories, as Freud had taught. It had layers, a personal layer, yes, containing the individual's own repressed and forgotten experiences, but beneath that, a much deeper layer that was not personal at all. He called this deeper layer the collective unconscious. Chapter 5. The Map of the Psyche. The collective unconscious was Jung's most original and most controversial contribution to psychology. The idea that beneath the personal unconscious of each individual lies a deeper layer of psychic content that is shared across all human beings, regardless of culture, language, or historical period. This shared layer is not made up of memories or experiences. It is made up of what Jung called archetypes, primordial patterns, templates, dispositions that shape the way human beings experience the world. Archetypes are not images or stories in themselves. They are more like empty forms, like the banks of a river that give shape to the water flowing through them. They manifest in consciousness as images, symbols, figures, and narratives. But the underlying pattern is universal. The most important archetypes Jung identified include the following: the shadow, the dark side of the personality, the collection of qualities, impulses, and characteristics that the conscious ego finds unacceptable, and has pushed into the unconscious. The shadow is not simply evil. It contains positive qualities too, things we have repressed because they seemed dangerous or socially unacceptable. The work of psychological development for Jung involved confronting and integrating the shadow, owning the darkness within ourselves rather than projecting it onto others. Much of human violence and cruelty, Jung argued, comes from the projection of the unacknowledged shadow onto other people, other groups, other nations, seeing in the external enemy the darkness we refuse to see in ourselves. The anima and animus, the feminine dimension within the male psyche, and the masculine dimension within the female psyche. For Jung, every person contains both masculine and feminine elements, and psychological wholeness requires integrating both. A man who is entirely cut off from his anima, from tenderness, from intuition, from relatedness, is as psychologically incomplete as a woman who is entirely cut off from her animus, from assertiveness, from rationality, from the capacity for independent action. The self, the central archetype of Jung's system, the archetype of wholeness and integration. The self is not the ego, the conscious sense of identity that most of us mean when we say I. The self is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together, the deep center around which the entire personality organizes itself. The goal of psychological development, what Jung called individuation, is the gradual realization of the self, the progressive integration of all the parts of the personality, including the shadow, the anima or animus, and the other complexes, into a coherent and authentic whole. The wise old man, the great mother, the hero, the trickster, these and many other archetypes populate the collective unconscious and manifest in the myths, fairy tales, religious symbols, and dreams of every culture in history. Jung spent decades documenting these parallels, showing how the same figures and narratives appear independently in cultures that had no contact with one another, arguing that this universality was evidence of the underlying reality of the collective unconscious. Chapter 6. Dreams, Symbols, and Synchronicity. For Jung, the primary language of the unconscious was the symbol, the image that points towards something that cannot be fully expressed in rational, logical language, and the primary channel through which the unconscious communicated its symbols to the conscious mind was the dream. Jung's approach to dream interpretation was fundamentally different from Freud's. For Freud, dreams were disguised wish fulfillments, the unconscious's way of expressing desires that the conscious mind would not permit in waking life. The dream's apparent content was a distortion of its true meaning, and the analyst's job was to strip away the disguise and reveal the hidden wish beneath. For Jung, this approach was too reductive. Dreams were not disguises. They were genuine communications from the unconscious, using the symbolic language that was natural to that deeper layer of the psyche. The analyst's job was not to strip away the symbol, but to understand it, to explore its resonances, its associations, its parallels in mythology and folklore, in its meaning within the broader context of the dreamer's life. He also developed in his later years one of his most controversial and fascinating concepts, synchronicity. Jung defined synchronicity as the meaningful coincidence of outer events and inner psychological states, a coincidence that has no causal explanation, but carries an undeniable sense of significance. The classic example Jung gave was from his own clinical practice. He was treating a patient, a highly rational, intellectually rigid woman who was resistant to psychological insight, when she described a dream in which she had been given a golden scarab beetle. At that exact moment, Jung heard a tapping at the window. He opened it, and a golden green scarab beetle, the closest European equivalent to the Egyptian scarab, flew into the room. The coincidence was so striking that it broke through the woman's rational defenses and opened her to the therapeutic process. Jung used it as an illustration of what he meant by synchronicity, events that are connected not by cause and effect, but by meaning, as if the outer world were occasionally responding to or reflecting the inner world of the psyche. This idea was deeply controversial. It seemed to many scientists and philosophers to abandon the territory of rational inquiry entirely and enter the realm of mysticism or superstition. Jung was aware of this criticism and never entirely resolved the tension between his scientific training and his intuitive conviction that meaning, not just mechanism, was a fundamental feature of reality. That tension was one of the most creative and most problematic aspects of his entire intellectual legacy. Chapter 7. The Private Man. Behind the theorist and the clinician, there was a private man of considerable complexity, and it must be said, considerable contradiction. Jung was married for 52 years to Emma Rauschenbach, an intelligent, perceptive woman from a wealthy Swiss family who became a distinguished psychologist in her own right and one of the most important contributors to Jungian theory. Their marriage was, by any conventional standard, successful. They had 5 children. Emma was deeply committed to Jung and to his work. She understood him, perhaps better than anyone else, and she supported him through his years of crisis with a steadiness that he later acknowledged as essential to his survival. But Jung was not faithful. For many years he maintained a relationship with Tony Wolff, a former patient who became his close collaborator, his intellectual companion and his lover. This relationship was not hidden. Emma knew about it, and the situation caused her enormous pain. Jung, characteristically, theorized about it rather than resolving it, arguing that his relationship with Tony Wolff represented his anima, the feminine dimension of his psyche that Emma, as his wife, could not fully embody. Whether this was genuine psychological insight or elaborate self-justification, the people best placed to judge, Emma and Tony, both suffered considerably as a result of the arrangement. Jung was also, during the early years of the Nazi period in Germany, naively and damagingly slow to distance himself from certain professional associations with the Nazi-aligned German psychiatric establishment. He took on the editorship of a journal that had become associated with Nazi ideology and made several statements about the differences between Jewish and Aryan psychology that at best reflected a profound political naivety and at worst suggested something more troubling. He later expressed regret for these associations and denied any sympathy with Nazi ideology. And there is substantial evidence that he helped Jewish colleagues and used his position to protect people at personal risk to himself. But the shadow, appropriately enough, remains, and serious biographers continue to debate what exactly his behavior during this period reveals about the man behind the theory. Chapter 8. The Tower and the Final Years. In 1923, Jung began building something that would become one of the most remarkable expressions of his inner life. A stone tower on the shores of Lake Zurich in a small village called Bollingen. He built the tower himself with his own hands over a period of decades, adding to it, modifying it, extending it as his understanding of himself deepened. He called it his confession in stone, a three-dimensional expression of his psyche, built without electricity or running water, a place where he could retreat from the modern world and its demands and enter into direct contact with the slower, deeper rhythms of life that he believed modern civilization had lost. At Bollingen, he cooked over an open fire, drew water from a well, and sat for long hours in contemplation. He carved stone inscriptions on the walls, fragments of Latin, Greek, and Gnostic texts that expressed something of his inner life that he could not put into more conventional language. He painted the walls of a small private room with images that were not intended to be seen by anyone else. Oh, the tower was, in a sense, the most honest self-portrait he ever created. More honest than his published works, more honest than his autobiography, because it was made not for an audience, but for himself, out of the same impulse that had driven him to fill the notebooks of the Red Book, the need to give form to the invisible, to make the inner life tangible and real. In his final years, Jung became increasingly concerned with what he saw as the spiritual crisis of modern Western civilization, the loss of living myth, the disappearance of the symbolic and the sacred from a culture that had reduced everything to mechanism and utility, the dangerous psychological consequences of a society that had lost contact with its own depth. He worked tirelessly, writing, seeing patients, corresponding with scholars, scientists, and artists from around the world, well into his 80s. His final major work, Man and His Symbols, was conceived as an introduction to his ideas for a general audience, written in response to a dream that told him he needed to communicate his ideas more widely. He dictated the last section of the book from his deathbed. He died on the 6th of June, 1961, at his home in Küsnacht, on the shores of Lake Zurich, at the age of 85. A thunderstorm broke over the lake shortly after his death, a detail that, for those who knew his story, felt almost too symbolic to be accidental. Final reflection. My friends, the story of Carl Jung is one of the most challenging and rewarding stories we have told in this series. It is challenging because Jung himself was a challenging figure. Brilliant and flawed, visionary and politically naive, capable of profound insight into the human psyche and of remarkable blindness about his own behavior. But it is rewarding because what he left behind, the concepts, the framework, the vocabulary for talking about the inner life, has genuinely enriched the way human beings understand themselves. Think about the words we use every day that Jung gave us or popularized: introvert and extravert. The recognition that people have fundamentally different orientations toward the world and that neither is superior to the other. The shadow, the acknowledgement that we all contain darkness and that the refusal to own that darkness is more dangerous than the darkness itself. The midlife crisis, the recognition that the second half of life presents a different set of psychological challenges than the first, and that the values and strategies that worked in youth may need to be fundamentally revised. Think about the recognition, radical, in Jung's time and still not fully absorbed by our culture, that the inner life is real, that dreams matter, that symbols matter, that the images that arise in the depths of the psyche are not mere noise, but communications from a part of ourselves that knows things our conscious mind does not. Jung taught us that becoming fully human is a lifelong project, that it requires not just the development of our strengths, but the honest confrontation with our weaknesses, our fears, our shadow, our unlived possibilities. He called this project individuation, the gradual, painful, rewarding process of becoming as fully as possible who you actually are rather than who you think you should be or who others need you to be. He was a man who mapped the soul. The map is imperfect. Maps always are. But it is the most detailed and the most honest map of the inner life that any single human being has ever drawn. And perhaps the most important thing he ever said, the thing I want to leave you with today, my friends, is this. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. Turn inward, not to escape the world, but to understand it more fully. Not to withdraw from life, but to engage with it from a deeper and more honest place. That is what Jung spent his entire life trying to do. And if his story can inspire even one person to begin that inward journey, to take their dreams seriously, to face their shadow honestly, to ask who they truly are beneath the roles and masks that life requires of them, then it has done its work. Thank you so much for listening. I hope your English has grown stronger today, and I hope this story has given you something to carry with you, not just into the world, but into the quiet places inside yourself. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and never stop looking inward.